Seven B 2 stealth bombers and a submarine launched a massive attack against Iran's three main nuclear facilities in Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo. The B 2s dropped bunker busters on Natanz and Fordo. The submarine fired Tomahawks at Isfahan. The US is claiming the sites were completely destroyed, but the response to the news is a little mixed.
This is an opportunity that I don't think the U.S. military could or was willing to waste.
I'm still struggling to see what exactly the end goal or the benefit that the United States has exactly by getting involved. It seems like the Israelis were doing quite a good job.
That was John Molick and Matthew Shoemaker. Molick is an intelligence officer in the Army National Guard. Shoemaker, a former U.S. intel officer who spent time on the Russia desk. They both said from what the early evidence shows, the strikes seemed successful, but the only way to know for sure is to gather more intelligence, like monitoring Iranian communications, relying on spies, or other methods.
The Trump administration is certainly claiming a victory lap with regards to this. One thing that I'm going to be looking out for, though, is if there is any contamination of the surrounding areas. Did this turn the area, in a certain sense, into a little bit of a dirty bomb? Or were we able to destroy it and yet bury it at the same time? So that would be a great question to have answered.
The strikes went off without a hitch, largely because Iran could not mount an effective defense. The Israeli Air Force made sure of that.
The air defense in Iran had been attacked very heavily over the last couple of weeks. There's a few different numbers as to what the percentage is, but it doesn't really matter ultimately what the total percentage is. Their air defense umbrella was certainly weakened. And, let's not forget that this policy for keeping the regime in Tehran from developing a nuclear weapon crosses administrations and has been a policy for a very long time. We really do need to go back to 1979 to really understand fully how much of a problem the United States government has had with the regime in Tehran. And this was just an opportunity that the U.S. couldn't bypass.
The Iranians vowed retribution and say the U.S. escalation put more targets on the table. The United States says it's not at war with Iran, and the Trump administration says the operation was more of a one and done, so peace talks can resume.
I'm very skeptical that that's going to be the case, just based off the way that the Iranians have operated for the entire life cycle of the current regime itself.
Iran is dedicated to proportional responses. And so they often like to, and not just often, really, most of the time, they like to respond to threats almost in the exact same manner that they had received them. And so they don't see the attacks on Fordo or Isfahan or Natanz as anything that has to do with civilians in particular. So I think they'll stick within the military realm. Nothing's out of the complete possibility, but I just don't think it to be likely.
And in fact, that's pretty much exactly what we're seeing. Less than 48 hours after Iran was attacked, and while I was editing the video for this story, Iran launched its own attack against U.S. bases in Iraq and Qatar. All of the missiles seem to have been intercepted, and there are no reports of injuries at this time. But the Iranian response could just be getting started.
One thing, though, that isn't really talked about in the news cycle right now is Iran's capability to conduct cyber attacks, which they tend to be fairly good at that. And that's something that I don't think that we've had enough of a discussion about. The Iranians could certainly create a lot of problems with regards to, the way that our banking system works, shutting down our banking, which would cause a lot of problems for a lot of people. They could potentially shut down things like airports, and start to stymie, travel within and between the United States and other countries. So that could certainly be a problem, something that we should certainly be looking out for and keeping at the back of our minds.
At the front of our minds should be the impacts from closing the Strait of Hormuz.
That's a plan that Iran has had for a long time, decades in planning.
Between 25 and 30% of the world's oil supply sails through the strait, which is only about 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iran's parliament voted to close it. The decision is ultimately up to the Iranian military, but because the whole world is sort of expecting that, the U.S. and its allies have counterplans.
There's many of them. So this is a wargaming thing that's gone on for a long time.
If the Iranians do succeed in closing the strait, however, there will be ripple effects felt by civilians the world over. why the US is asking for China's help in convincing Iran to keep the strait open. Just north of China, in Russia, former President Dmitry Medvedev says several countries are now ready to give Iran nuclear weapons so it can protect itself from further military actions. That could just be more Russian bluster, but it's certainly a sign Moscow is going to take advantage of any anti-American sentiment within the international community.
One thing that the Russians are certainly going to be excited about, if I can use that term, is that the United States has conducted yet another preemptive strike and preemptive attack on another country, in a certain sense justifying Russia's own actions in Ukraine. The Russians are certainly going to use that as cover for their own activities.
The messaging from the Trump administration in the aftermath of the strikes is a little fractured. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Sunday morning the U.S. is not interested in regime change, and then President Trump posted on Truth Social, the Iranian people may want to consider finding a new regime that could make Iran great again. Whether that happens and whether Iran still has the capacity to get a nuclear weapon remain to be seen. For more unbiased, straight fact reporting like this, download the Straight Arrow News app today.